Hello, everyone. I am in a hotel room in London. It is almost midnight here, but some news has broke in the, I guess, North America region, and we're going to talk about it today. Of course, this coverage brought to you by Alienware, but I'm joined by Phil Aram, though some people say Aram. What, Phil?
Aram.
Aram.
It's like air dash like you're not certain about air.
Yeah,
You
the
know?
fact that your
Air
last name is literally Aram is what throws so many people
I
off.
know.
Or I guess not literally, but spelled that way.
That's understandable for them. But
Yeah.
you've
You and I
known me
have
a
known
while.
each other for a while. Listen, it's
So
midnight in
this was
London.
tough. I,
Um,
I
so
appreciate it. Thanks for coming back and leaving Magic the Gathering early
yes,
to
thank you.
talk to me.
Well, I didn't leave it early. I went undefeated.
Okay.
So
Congrats.
let's talk about the crazy news. So, for context setting for people that don't or haven't been paying attention, a couple weeks ago in an interview with John Needham, I broke the news that the LCS team owners had voted unanimously to drop the requirement for to field challenger teams. The team owners are not allowed to do that without Riot's consent as part of their agreement to be participate in the league. And so this was kind of a formal request to Riot. I understand there was some conversation back and forth in that interview. Needham said that they were taking it seriously due to concerns around making sure that the teams are financially viable. And the news came out today in an article titled, "What was it?" It's like we're still committed. Our commitment to
Our commitment to the NACL.
the NACL.
Subtitled, we remain committed to evolving the NA talent development pipeline.
Right. So details there basically saying that the NACL is not going anywhere, but this all and a bunch of other stuff, but it all came basically after an opening paragraph explaining that the teams will not need to do that or will not need to field NACL teams in summer, which starts very soon. So Phil, go ahead and let me know as the head of Players Association if there's any context setting that I have missed there before we get into sort of the background of what your experience has been like dealing with this.
I think you've captured the context from Riot's perspective as best as you can. I have some ship of Theseus questions about the NACL remaining the same. If the NACL in name is there, but all of the parts within have changed, is it still the NACL? One might ask. So I have some philosophical quandaries on that one, but
Sure.
otherwise, I think you captured the state of play from the Riot and team perspective pretty accurately.
There was some additional reporting and some rumors around the idea that this was planned to happen most likely in 2024 anyway, and that this was actually moving up to summer 2023. I don't know if you have context on that, if that was a thing, or if Players Association was ever informed of discussions to have this happen in 2024.
Yeah, I think an important piece of context to kind of start this off is I think for a lot of people, few people really understand how the PA fits into the dynamics of decision making within Riot teams, the LCS, and so on. My job as the executive director of the PA, I meet regularly with our player leadership and our player reps to get information about the state of things, what players want. Take that, meet with Riot every week. Every week, I have at least one meeting with somebody at Riot, whether it's the LCS team, the commissioner, who there is not a commissioner at the moment, but generally the commissioner, the head of the person who is in charge of Champions Queue, the person who's in charge of the NACL, and all these different pieces. So I'm meeting regularly with each of these components in the LCS to talk about what are the plans for the future, what are the players advocating and pushing for. We always have active asks into Riot for considering policy changes and otherwise, and they similarly come back to us talking about policy changes they're considering. We have a long-standing policy, and I went through this on social media. In good faith between ourselves and Riot, we negotiate without going public on matters, as long as we're in active negotiations and in good faith trying to find consensus middle ground. In my 2 years doing the job, we've never had a situation where we weren't able to find a middle ground. And there have been a lot of situations where I've had to look across the camera usually and through the screen at someone at Riot and say, "Hey, this is a red line issue for us. And if you were to move forward with the position that's currently being discussed, we would have to take a public conversation." And in my 2 years, we've always been able to navigate those back to a place where player leadership and Riot and teams were coming to some sort of consensus solution. Good example would be 2 years ago. The conversation around making NACL optional is not, when it was called Academy, was not new. It's been around. That was one of the first things I dealt with. You'll remember there was a vote. There was talk of a vote of owners wanting to make it optional a couple of years ago. And we came in and we talked with Riot and we said that wouldn't work. The infrastructure for the league is not set up in a way that would cause it to be sustainable at all if you took away the requirement. There's no promotion to the LCS possible. There's no financial support within the league. There's no reason for anyone to be in this thing unless the teams are required to. There just isn't a sustainable model for anyone else to come in that's realistic, and Riot acknowledged it. And we also acknowledged that some teams post-COVID had some desire to have players be remote to save costs or other things. And so we came up with a bargain. The teams were allowed to have players be remote if they wanted to, but they still had to pay California salaries. So, and we maintained servers in Los Angeles to encourage teams to stay more centered around California. So that was a compromise we came up with at that time. Fast forward 2 years to today, we're actively talking with Riot. The same story's back. Team owners want to make it optional, and we're looking at it as a possibility for 2024. That's pretty standard in the work that we're doing behind the scenes. We hear about, team owners are on one side of an issue and we're on the other side, and there's a decision to be made for next year. In all of our time working with Riot, unless it's been an emergency situation, truly, where there was take the perks transfer situation where they had to change a rule immediately because there was a competitive issue at play. They don't do things in the year you're talking about it. They do things the next year. And we talk about that and we say, hey, this is looking at 2024. So that was really important in this context. We knew fully that team owners wanted to make it optional again, and we were talking with Riot about our options. In our post that we put up on social media, we listed out exactly what we had proposed to Riot as solutions that fell short of removing the requirement, and our reasons why, which is that if you remove the requirement, they still have not done enough in that space to make it palatable for any third-party organization to come in and feel like there's a genuine reason to be there and to be successful. That if you pulled the requirement, the whole thing would fall flat, jobs would be lost, and nobody would fill the gaps. To this day, Riot has not expressed to us any plan as to how they are going to solve that problem. We had transition plans in mind, including affiliate programs where teams could use third parties to share costs and try and bolster third parties in the short run with resource sharing, all sorts of stuff. And they've today ignored all of those things and just gone full bore forward with this. I call it a midday massacre. They're just opening the floodgates for teams to kill jobs and kill the NACL, and with it the future of the LCS. More than half of players came up through the NACL, and that's going to be gone overnight. A lot of people are going to have to go do something else than pursue a professional League of Legends career in North America.
So a couple things there. I saw some feedback in the immediate reaction where people were to your post saying like, oh, now the Players Association says something. They haven't been saying anything for a long time, and like it's interesting that they're finally speaking up. But it sounds like from what you're saying, just because people have not seen those conversations publicly does not mean that the Players Association has not been working behind the scenes for several years now, fighting against these types of decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. We're constantly in a battle and a conversation around how to improve player conditions. And, I'd say, let's talk brass tacks. There are times when we meet with Riot and they say they want to do something that we know players don't want. And sometimes what I'll say to Riot is like, if you want to do something, that's harmful to players, our list of things that we're asking for. And if you want to negotiate, talk to us about something that you can put on the table to make, if you want to do some change here that players do not favor, give us something on the other side that we could maybe come back and say, okay, that's an acceptable trade-off. And that is generally how it goes. There's some sort of trade-off if there's, if we're not able to, fully combat a change that we don't think is good for players. Oftentimes we can make a trade-off, or historically we've always made some sort of trade-off, which again is why we're never making public statements, because we feel like we've come to an understanding that's acceptable for all parties. Here, we've been completely ignored, and not just ignored. You can clip this and post it. We have been lied to. We were told throughout the process this year from many people at Riot that changes were being considered for 2024. And that is not what has happened. I found out that they were going to do this the same way you found out. LEC Wulu posted on Saturday. And when we posted from the PA side saying we didn't believe there were changes in 24, that's because, and we didn't believe that there were changes to the import rule, that's because Riot had told us point blank to our faces within the previous week that neither of those things were happening, and that is not what, we were not going to be seeing that in 2023. And they just completely reversed. And we found out through a tweet, which is the biggest breach of trust I've ever experienced with Riot. And we as a player association have, we really have no understanding for how to navigate this going forward, except to come out and speak out and ask people to stand up with us and stand up against this bullshit. Like, that's what it is. It's outrageous.
So a couple of hours ago when they tweeted, that's how you found out. And you had previously
No, no,
been
no.
under the assumption.
Saturday.
Saturday. Okay,
Saturday was when we found out.
Gotcha.
When we got that on Saturday, we tweeted, and then I wrote to Riot and asked them, hey, this can't be true, right? They asked to talk on Monday. On Monday, we got on a call, and they said, there's no commissioner right now for the LCS, so it was a conglomerate of people filling the role in some capacity. And we got on a call with a bunch of people who I've talked to before, and they said, yes, it is true. We are considering this for 2023. We haven't made a decision yet. We talked at length. I talked to them that this was absolutely a red line issue for us, that we viewed this as a breach of trust and a turning back on a word that was given to us. They said that they were going to go back and reconsider. We said that we were told there would be a decision made by Wednesday. On Wednesday, I received no message and reached out to them late in the afternoon asking if they were still planning on making a decision on Wednesday. They replied saying that they had not made a decision yet and asking for us to meet on Friday instead. And we met on Friday today at 11:45 Pacific time. And the moment that our call was over, they posted their final decision. On our last call on Friday, I implored them not to do this, to reverse this decision, and to let us go back to the negotiating table and get talking about 2024. And they pushed it through anyways, in spite of knowing that they're going back on their word, that they don't have a plan, that they have no, there's no belief that the NACL will be a thriving space. They put a bunch of stuff in their post that makes it sound like they've come up with ideas. Everything in that post was something we've talked about over the last 2 years as, little components. They're not plans for how to make NACL successful. And they know it, and they're just trying to window dress it to make it look better.
In your conversations with them over the past week or so, did they give explanations for why these decisions were being made and why they were moving up what could have been a 2024 decision to summer?
The only reasoning that was given to us as to the decision to do it now was that they believe that the economics of teams are, they basically said, that we think the teams have a point about the economics being hard, and we're gonna throw them this bone. And I want to point out a couple things numbers wise. The entire salary cost of an NACL roster is about 16% of what the average overhead cost of an LCS org's players are. So if you put all the LCS players on a team and all the NALCS players on a team together, the whole roster of NACL is about 16% of the cost. So it's a minuscule compared to the regular salary costs, minuscule compared to their bloated C-suites, minuscule compared to their rosters in other games where they're getting even less return on investment. Minuscule compared to their giant footprints with training facilities that sit empty and unused. So the idea that the NACL, the space that creates developmental talent, that gets you a player on a minimum contract for 3 years, so you can have an affordable, low cost player in the LCS, the most tried and true method in sports to keep costs down. Getting rid of that is the solution for financial woes. Is, I think, about as intellectually bankrupt as you could possibly have for an idea.
And I've heard some people state that, I know you say 16%, but just because I want to give you the opportunity to respond to the number that I imagine will start to come out, is I've heard a lot of people say it's about $500,000 or more a year or annually. Does that number sound about right with the 16%?
Yeah, so it I would say 500,000 is probably all in costs when you include coaches. I'm talking for because now we get data on salaries and information. So we know aggregate data for salaries. So I'm talking just player salaries. There are currently teams are incurring housing, food, coaches, and support staff, all of which are important for the record. These are not meaningless things. Um, but when I'm talking 16%, I'm talking salaries, pure player salaries across LCS and NACL. So yeah, 500,000 all in. That sounds accurate. In our proposal that we gave to Riot and which we posted publicly online, we laid out a series of changes which we believed would have allowed the NACL to stay fully functional and operational, um, maintain professionalism and keep the pipeline thriving while saving on costs significantly. So we believe that allowing, because right now teams do have to pay NACL players based on California minimum salaries, which was a compromise from the past I mentioned before. We were willing to concede to allow regionalized salaries. So if a team allowed their players to go remote, you could, in theory, have your whole team locate in Indiana and pay them whatever the prevailing wage of Indiana is, which is going to be much less than California. You could have them play remote and not provide housing or provide food. These suggestions and compromises that we were willing to make and work on a transition towards a future where there isn't a mandate, we think would reduce those total costs by up to 50%. So that was what we put forward. We put forward a real plan with real, with taking, really tightening the belt ourselves to be able to find a future forward. Our plan was talked about for months and totally ignored by the leaders at Riot. Um, you know,
The one of the things that you had mentioned earlier in our conversation was the idea that right now in the NACL, Riot doesn't really have a reason, doesn't give teams a reason as a third party to operate in that space. There are, of course, currently third party teams operating in that space. So would you just dispute that, like, or is that a situation where those teams don't necessarily have a reason to? Because obviously that could be pointed out as an example of like, well, you say nobody wants to do it or would do it or it doesn't make sense to, but obviously there are teams that are.
yes. So there are some groups that operate. They are uh, we have had frank conversations between ourselves and Riot that there is not a model. These are conversations I've had with people directly at Riot where we agree on these principles. Any third party operating in the NACL currently does not have a viable business model. They do not have a means to make money because there is not a place to sell sponsorships effectively. There is not a revenue sharing program. And the money that you can recoup from selling a player contract into the LCS or up to a LCS orgs NACL team versus your own do not generate enough revenue to be sustainable. In fact, they are actively bad because when you see sola fide situations, there are orgs that come in speculatively believing that they will identify young talent and sell them at such a profit that the profit of selling the players will make up the costs that they're incurring for paying their players. And then when the players don't sell, they don't have the money to pay. This is actively a problem we have discussed with Riot. Riot has acknowledged, and we have been working with Riot to try and find solutions to prevent groups like Sola Fide from entering and working on speculative models for talent sales because that's how players end up getting in vulnerable situations. So there's a known problem that any of these teams currently participating don't have a viable path towards sustainability at the NACL level.
So, kind of looking at it from the team perspective, the LCS team perspective, I think that is what they would say, right? Is like, why should we, if there's no point in running an NACL team, we see no recouping of costs and investing into this, and it's just a drain on our company. What would you say to them, or what do you think is the retort to that? Because obviously they're saying, well, if a third party's not worth it, it's probably not worth it for us.
Yeah, it's just not correct for the LCS teams. The problem with the LCS system is that we have a closed loop franchise. It is one of the most, it is the core problem of American sports in general, and Riot has already acknowledged and addressed it in their Valorant system to some degree. Not totally, but to some degree. The idea that you must continue to earn participation or that teams may earn promotion into the core league. In the America's Valorant League, teams that are in the Challengers League can get promoted into the upper league on performance. That's not possible in League of Legends space, which makes participation at that level not viable because you would be participating like pre-franchising with the hopes that you would get promoted and that promotion would allow you to make money to sustain your business. If you're an LCS team right now, the reason why you need an academy team is because the model does not allow for others to successfully develop talent at a sustainable level of any kind. So you need to be able to function in that space to help pipeline talent, because the only way that LCS teams can manage their costs effectively, as is seen in traditional sports with Major League Baseball's AAA system, the G League in basketball, and on college football, which is sort of a toxic NCAA version of it all. But these are the ways that American sports find and pipeline talent. And the LCS is operated in the same way and needs to, because if the LCS teams are not working actively to invest in the future of the region, there will not be a future of the region, because many young players who would like to become professionals and maybe need a couple years of development cannot commit full time, will have to go do other things with their time in their lives, and will not end up in a place where the LCS has a future. We're not going to have young players who are able to come up because there's going to be a limited number of collegiate programs that some of them will be able to get into, or a couple of organizations that will pay them $500 a month independent contractor salaries that won't actually pay the bills and won't allow them to focus their time to be a part of what John Needham has described as the future of sports. I would like to note that he has talked as recently as April 19th about building the future of sports, and by all accounts here is abandoning that in North America. There won't be a future because there's no plan to help the next generation come up.
I think there's a lot of folks who I think are more cynical and will say, well, we're losing the NA Development League, but there's no NA players that are good enough, right? Like, it's the teams are already importing a ton. It seems like Riot put the kibosh on the false rumor or incorrect rumor that there was import rule changes coming next year, but still we end up in a situation where there's a lot of teams that are not running North American talent players, or when they are, they're running them, players that have existed for a very long time in the league. So I guess what would you say to folks that say, hey, developing NA talent, it doesn't work, the teams import anyway?
Yeah, I mean there are imports, and we're proud of the imports in our league and the part that they play in helping build the LCS. The truth of the matter is that more than half of all the players in our league in the LCS come from the NACL and came up through the NACL. So it is a huge part of what's built our league. And almost half of the players who've competed for us internationally came up through the NACL. It's not all teams and players who are imports that make up the upper echelon of what the LCS has been. Yeah, there's been competitive struggles, but there's only one pathway that this leads to, and it is the LCS becoming a less and less viable league at any level. There's not going to be, if half the league's talent pool erodes, there's not going to be a world where the LCS is anything but a secondary region in the future. And Riot has, on camera and on camera to you, said repeatedly that they're committed to this region and they believe in this region. And now their actions speak louder than their words, because this is a failure of leadership. And that's why we come at Riot before we come at teams, because Riot claims to be stewards of their game as a sport, and here they are failing in their stewardship.
Looking at these teams, I think there are some, and this is even a thought that I've had in the past, where it's like forcing the teams to invest in a league that they don't want to invest into. It feels as though they will probably not be operating in good faith whenever they put forth these teams, right? If they are forced or coerced to operate them in the NACL against their own desires or their own faith and belief in that system, which it sounds like from what I've heard, many of the teams do not feel as though it is a system that is going to lead them to the success that they want, that it's almost kind of pointless, right? You're forcing them into participating in a system that they don't actually believe in, and thus they will not try, or they will not actually operate it in a meaningful way. So I wonder, is there any point in forcing the teams to participate in it if they will not be doing so in good faith?
Two things on this one. So NACL had playoffs this spring, and this was the first time they had non LCS LCS backed teams in the NACL. Like obviously, also the first year it's called NACL versus Academy, but the first time there's been more than 10 teams, and you've had these third party orgs that are outside of Riot's partner program in there. And when they did those playoffs, only the EG Challenger team was eliminated in the first round. So to say that these, the I think the impression is that you're saying many of these teams are actively eschewing any effort into this and not putting a good foot forward. The vast majority of these teams are clearly the best in the region of the talent below the LCS. And the vast majority of these teams are beating the other third party groups that come in. So I think it is clear that in a world that we are in today, the quality of competition is going to fall significantly because you're effectively going to be losing 7 or 8 of your top 9 or 10 teams just off of results from last season. You'll lose a significant portion of those teams will cease to exist or exist in a much smaller capacity. Maybe some of these teams, LCS teams, instead of cutting, will have them all switch to IC agreements and become part-time players. And you'll see lots of players walk away and lesser talent become what's available. I don't know all the externalities yet, but these are the things that we expect to see on that side of this. So that's the first part. The second part is look at our proposal. One of the key components of our proposal is to allow for affiliate status between teams and third parties. We understand that there are some organizations that don't put enough of time and effort into developing talent, even though it is objectively the right way to build a successful esports program, to develop younger talent, to nurture it from within, to have them come on at rookie contracts at lower prices than might be their free market value once they've been around for 2 or 3 years. Those are classical sports methods we know work. But there are teams that, in spite of that, do not put their best foot forward. And so we have proposed and talked with Riot extensively about allowing teams to have affiliate status. It was a suggestion that we put forward for last year. We would have approved it to have been the case for 2023. The idea there, let's say Wildcard Gaming wants to work with Dignitas. I'm just throwing out 2 teams on either side of the fence here as a hypothetical. If they wanted to work together, then Wildcard Gaming could have run the Dignitas team. It could have been called Wildcard Gaming and you wouldn't have had to have Dignitas there, but Dignitas would have owned the contracts. We would have known that the players were paid in full and paid legal salaries. And Wildcard could have helped incur costs, paying for some coaching staff, paying for housing or other things, helping to reduce the overall cost of the team. This was a proposal that we made for last year, and we thought would have been positive actively to help reduce the number of teams that are not being good stewards in this space and allow organizations that are passionate about trying to work in the tier 2 space a way to become sustainable. That was a pathway that we saw as viable to make these orgs sustainable. They can get some revenue from, there's some of their costs can be incurred by the LCS org, and they can still have the brand and work on building their capacity and showing their ability to compete. So that's a proposal we put forward that actively helps to solve for that problem while also creating a pathway for these third-party orgs to start building fandom, start building capacity to be able to run, because they're not able to run today. We're not even walking. We're barely crawling at this stage for most of these orgs.
If it came out that this was the only way for some of these teams and organizations in the LCS to stay, I don't know, actual entities and not lead into bankruptcy in 2023, would you feel like this is an acceptable thing? Or I mean, I guess the interesting thing is that us on the outside, or for many of us on the outside, we don't know the books for a lot of these orgs, and there's a lot of doom and gloom right now within the space with sponsors pulling out and VCs not being able to invest in the way that they have before. So I guess the question is like, how is there a point at which the financial situations of these orgs get so dire that you would concede that they cannot continue to operate an NACL team?
No, because as we've gone over the cost side, an NACL roster is costing today on average is costing 16% of a total salary spend for a team. So the NACL is not what's breaking the camel's back for these orgs' financial viability. If teams are struggling to the point where we're running an NACL roster, especially if we had gone under some of our proposals and helped them to reduce those costs even further, but maintain their rosters, if they were still at the breaking point of bankruptcy, then they ought to be looking for other partners because they have more systemic issues than maintaining an NACL team. You cannot you cannot make a short-term decision like this that abandons the future of your game. This is kicking the can down the road for a bigger problem, and it will not lead to any sort of healthy solution. They need the existence of the NACL is paramount for the LCS to be any kind of viable league in the long term. It is just that simple.
Just because we're live streaming this right now, I've seen some folks in Twitch chat saying 16% is a lot. 16% is a lot. If you can cut your costs 16%, that might be a lot. I don't know if you have a reaction to that, just because I want to give you the floor to be able to respond to folks who have that opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. My point is that there are significant other costs across these organizations that are possible to be they're possibly to be curtailed. They're on top of it, we have put forward proposals that would reduce that cost even further. And at the knowing I worked at those teams. I worked at Evil Geniuses for many years. I've seen the books on teams. I know what they look like, and I can say with confidence that if teams are struggling or going under, it's not because of their NACL team. It's because they've got an Apex roster that's not working, or they decided that they were going to be in the Overwatch League, or they're paying millions of dollars in franchise fees and it's not panning out, or they leveraged themselves on a crypto deal and made a bet on a facility with a crypto deal that has a lot of cost to it but didn't work out. The NACL is not the reason orgs are going under. If anything, the NACL is a savior for orgs. Every team that's running a player that they promoted out of the NACL is running a player that's vastly below the average cost of a typical LCS player. Those are the cheapest players and talent that you can find, is an NACL player that you have developed and promoted. And I will tell you anecdotally right now that 2 years ago, when we were told that teams wanted to remove this requirement, the next year was the year that Danny made his premiere for Evil Geniuses, and JoJo came up shortly thereafter, and EG had a lot of success. And you know what happened that year? No teams asked to remove the NACL requirement or the at that time academy requirement, because every team saw how beneficial it was to do that. You could be competitive with a middle of the road roster spend in cost because you used homegrown talent. It is, and everyone at Riot agrees with this too. The people I meet with at Riot and I talk to at Riot, we all shake our heads wondering why teams don't spend more effort and more investment in the NACL. It's the best dollar you can spend, is to invest in your NACL team and put talent development at the forefront. It's just that simple. So 16% is the best deal you're going to get.
So I want to now open the floor a little bit to, I guess we kind of already have a little bit, but to the Twitch chat, because I think the community does not always have, it is easy for me even though I'm not on the team side or the Riot side or the Players Association side, to just understand some fundamental aspects of the situation. And so I think it'd be nice if we have the opportunity for folks in Twitch chat to also ask questions here, and we can filter those in. We won't do like the Hotline League call-in thing, but why don't we go ahead and take some? So,
can I address one question that
yes.
I saw that it's helpful to do? I've seen here and in a couple other places questions about the LCSPA being owned and funded by Riot. I'd like to clear up that when I came on and took the job 2 years ago, the LCSPA and Riot had severed the funding relationship. My entire tenure I was not hired by Riot. I have not been paid by Riot, and we have gone out and built independent funding through our group licensing program. So we do not take any dollars from Riot Games. We're not beholden to them. And let me tell you, if I was getting paid by Riot, I'm sure they would not be very happy with me sitting here saying a lot of very mean things about them right now. So if there's any confusion there, we are not owned or operated by Riot. We are owned and operated by players. I'm paid by players, and players decide to hire me and fire me and everything in between.
I'm seeing several questions in the chat about a potential player strike. Is there a chance of there being a player strike?
We're leaving everything on the table right now. We're in active talks between splits, and when we get to competition time, we will see what decisions get made. But we have not taken anything off the table at this point.
Just as a follow-up to that on kind of my end, I think for me personally, in my conversations with players over the past decade, it is often hard for players to look across or look against their own personal interests or outside of their own personal interests. And I think for many players in the LCS, I can see a world where they might say to themselves, well, I've got a job. So why do I need to worry about, competition, potential competition from players that would come out of NALCS? Perhaps they don't have as much concern about the longevity of the sport as much as they might have concern about their own careers. So I am curious if you feel like that is not the case right now with the LCS player base, that there is a world where they would look more altruistically on trying to do something that would be meaningful for the league versus sort of meaningful for their own career.
Yeah, I think that players care a great deal, and my job has always been to come and meet them where they're at and speak to them with their availability and with their focus is. And today, I hear from players across the LCS, not just the NACL, who are terrified by these decisions. They are they're mortified because they see a developer who does not show the same passion and care that they once felt for the work that they did and for the future of their jobs and their career. They see that the NACL going this way leaves very little left to take except from them if you're an LCS player. It's there's a it's just the LCS left. If we lose half our people, it's that simple, and it feels very real to be and very vulnerable to be in a position um, where you're now um, where you're now under the gun in that way for um, for the next harsh decision to be made, and they understand that there needs to be a stand taken and that we can't sit idly by in this situation. And we're going to keep working as lots of players learn about this for the first time today. Not every player is active in the off season on social or otherwise, and we're working through our Snowflake network to make sure every player understands what's happening, communicating with each other, trying to build consensus and build plans for how we can fight this and how we can bring truth to this situation and understanding around what needs to be done, and hopefully have the support of the community to fight Riot on this and help tell them loudly that they need to need to turn back this decision and do what needs to be done to protect the future of the LCS.
There are several questions about if the LCSPA is interested or would consider going into a formal union to force collective bargaining, and obviously there's follow-up questions around if that would also include a salary cap and if the players are open to that. But is there a world where this could lead to a union for the players?
There absolutely is. At the end of the day, it'll be up to the players to vote to determine to convert the association into a union. That's a vote that they will have to decide on, but it's a very real possibility, and there are more there are more precedents there than were in the past that could allow us to potentially pursue that possibility. But it's again something that we have not taken off the table, and we'll continue to talk with player leadership about in the coming weeks around how we can protect players and their futures.
I've seen several questions. I know we kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but just because it seems as though this could be a topic that goes back and forth on this topic a lot. But Mean Squared here says, what is the hard data regarding a return on investment for an LCS team investing 16% into NACL salary? Again, this idea of if teams are investing 16% of the cost into NACL salary, how is that something that they can get that return on investment on, since there's no direct monetization of the NACL?
Again, it comes down to cost savings. It's the same as exists in any traditional sport. When you talk in National Football League, they often talk about when you sign a rookie quarterback, you draft one highly. Just occurred in this draft recently that it's the most efficient thing you can do in the sport because that position will eventually cost you tens of millions of dollars, and right now it only costs you one, and it gives you a great opportunity to compete with lower costs. It's the same exact situation here. Whenever a team promotes a player from the NACL to their starting roster, you can almost rest assured that they're playing at a very low salary relative to the average or median salary, and that team is incurring significant cost savings. Any team that's doing this is saving money, and that is the that is the most simple benefit that is going on there, let alone the needs and requirements. Even with this change, we fully expect there to be requirements for teams to maintain subs. You will have to have some amount of capacity to bring in players when you're traveling and competing internationally in case of visa issues and other things. This is not going to be a world where teams are able to fully forego. So there's also a risk component that you have to measure in. Teams will have to incur and hold on to some of these things and would anyways. And that's the purpose that the NACL serves for teams, even outside of promotion and cost savings there. But the cost savings promotion is the simplest, most straightforward part. If you are in sports, when I went in Ryan Evil Geniuses and we got a League of Legends team, the first thing myself and Greg Kim talked about that put us eye to eye was saying what we need to do in the first 2 years is build a pipeline to be able to bring up at least 1 or 2 rookie talents, because that is what is going to make our operation like able to save costs and not be at the top of the league in spending while maintaining competitiveness. It's that simple.
Rathacon says, do you fear this can lead to talent hoarding by the few LCS orgs that may stay in the NACL scene?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll absolutely see some teams do that, and it'll become a place where it'll be even harder for those teams that are short-sighted in their decision making and exit the NACL. It'll begin to look more like La Liga in European football. If anybody understands how it works there, the academy systems in those leagues allow for the top organizations to effectively have all of the youth talent on contract and on loan at all times. And so every good player that comes up through the Italian system ends up being tied to one of a couple of teams historically. And that means that those teams will always stay at the top because they will always be able to choose which players actually get out of their system and onto new teams. And we could very well see that develop here. And we will have, the parity that we have the parity that we've seen in the sport in recent years, where teams outside of the classic brands have been able to make runs at Worlds or MSI, obviously Golden Guardians this year being a chief example. I think that world will go away. We'll see a very bifurcated situation with a few teams who truly control all the talent and the talent potential, and everyone else who will be trapped at the bottom forever.
As a aside to this current situation, I guess I'm curious what you think will be the fallout from this from the team side. Do you have any estimations on how many teams will stay in the NACL? I don't know if you've heard rumors or if you've had conversations with the team or have any idea of what the other side of this may look like.
Yeah, I had this conversation directly with Riot this week, and I will share it here because they have breached our trust, and I feel 100% confident in speaking the truth of what was said between us. I asked them point blank because they said the requirement's going away, but the league will still be there. As they said, the NACL is not going anywhere, and we think teams will still participate. I pushed back on that, and I said, how many teams exactly do you think will stay in the NACL? How many teams do you think will maintain a roster? And at first, I was told by Raul, who made that post, that he thought he couldn't say. It would be too hard to say how many teams would maintain. And I said, I know you have a number in your head because I do too. Tell me how many teams you think will stay in. And he said 3, pause, or 4, maybe. And I said 3 because that's the number I think in my head. That we'll see maybe as many as 3 teams maintain rosters. Now, I've already begun to see behind the scenes some teams go with tactics that may or may not pass legal muster. There are some teams who we're hearing may already be telling players to take lower salaries to maintain their rosters, but not just lower, but potentially salaries that are below legal wage limits. We'll be watching and investigating and following and reporting back to Riot if any of their decisions here cause teams to make changes that break the law. We've yet to get confirmation from Riot whether or not teams that stay in the NACL will no longer need to be GCD, have their players GCD'd. By and large, if a player's in the GCD, it means they have to follow legal wage laws, and
The
they may not
global
have
contract
to.
database for those that aren't
Yep.
familiar.
Yep. We don't know yet, because again, Riot has no plan. I cannot say with enough certainty and confidence here. Every time I've ever worked with Riot on anything, we have a white paper and a proposal, and we know every tiny externality that's going to happen with any change that goes through. There is no plan here. I have so many more questions than answers because they don't have answers themselves. In fact, they said to me today on my 15-minute call before this was announced that Their team was actively working on trying to come up with the incentives that would make it viable for a team to stay in the NACL. And that is to say, they have no plan. They don't believe that teams are going to stay in this, and they did this decision anyways. And it's shameful.
I mean, I think the most disheartening thing about that is if they don't have a plan, or they won't be able to put something in place until most likely 2024, because obviously these types of things take a while. I do wonder how many players will just wash out of the league or leave right now because they won't have a spot and they'll just move on there with their lives, right? It's kind of hard to keep people around for 6 months. So I'm trying to keep this mostly about questions and stuff, but I have a hard time. I have a hard time not thinking in the moment about sort of the ramifications of the people that are going to do this. You mentioned in your post about this, but maybe here you could elaborate a little bit on the amount of folks that you anticipate will lose jobs potentially as of today, potentially.
Yeah, we set up to as many as 70 we think may lose their jobs. You have 50 players alone who are in the NACL. You have the coaching staffs, oftentimes 2 or 3 coaching. You have managers and assistant managers who run those teams. And then you have just the fact that more staff means there's other people involved who may not be necessary because because they no longer require a full-time role, or you could have someone else take up the slack that's available now that this position's gone. And these were numbers that we talked to members at other organizations to ask them what they thought. We vetted all of our numbers. We've known about this possibly coming for a week. So we were hard and diligent in talking to others. This isn't just our number. 70 is a number that we've been told by members of teams, people working on the teams, what they think is going to happen. General managers who would go unnamed because they don't want to be targeted by their own ownership groups who called for this change. Because there isn't support. Again, the GMs, the coaches, the managers, the Riot staff at the LCS level, all these people know that this change is catastrophic and disastrous, and that it is craven and has just absolutely no benefits to the ecosystem.
Now, our viewership on the stream has doubled since the beginning, and I know you mentioned this at the beginning, but just because a lot of people in the chat were not here earlier, and I see somebody mentioning it. Somebody says that you should have stressed communication with Riot and actually put in an effort prior to this last-minute scramble session. Where was all this effort the last 2 years? Too late now. So if I know you touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but if just for those that are joining now, do you want to reiterate a little bit of what you said in the beginning about what this process has looked like for the past 2 years?
Yes. So I've been doing this job for 2 years. From the beginning, we meet weekly with people at Riot at all levels, depending on the week in the meeting. We have regularly scheduled standing meetings at every level of the LCS to talk about all of the departments, plans for next year, rule changes, cooperative programs, what team owners want, what players want, and we negotiate. And we don't make a lot of public statements. In fact, we've worked very hard to avoid ever doing this because this is our best ammunition. And it is the best thing that we have in case of emergency is to take a fight public and to do this. And so anytime behind the scenes that we're negotiating with Riot, we will always tell them that if this is a red line issue, that's what we'll say. I've talked to our leadership, and what's being proposed is something that we consider to be a red line issue. And if you were to move forward with that currently, we would have to take a public stance against it and fight to have it changed. That is how we approach things. We try and be forthright with them behind the scenes, and we take it very seriously when we have an issue that goes to that level with Riot. And we've always been able to come to a solution behind the scenes that found a middle ground where all sides could be agreeable, and we would be able to support a final outcome or whatever the situation was. We could make trade-offs. 2 years ago is a great example because team owners wanted the academy requirement removed at that time. We negotiated and were able to get that requirement changed to instead still require teams, but teams were allowed to be remote if they so chose, as long as they paid California minimum salaries still. So those are the changes that we have worked on very clearly. And this was a change that was talked about for months, but was always talked about in the context of being 2024. Every change that was being considered in our talks this year with Riot was 2024 only. There would be no changes to 2023. We were in active conversations about what it might look like in good faith negotiation. They knew that this was a red line issue for us. even for 2024, and that we were going to need to try and find a better middle ground solution in our hopes. And they pulled the rug out from under us here. We found out the same as you in a leak on Saturday night that they were thinking about changing it for 2023. And we've spent the last week working nonstop to try and get Riot to see sense here and not massacre the future of the LCS.
So I think we can start to wind down here with just a couple more questions from the chat. But I guess as we're getting some more questions in the chat, I know we chatted about this a little bit before we started recording, but I think it was LCS EV, who I believe is still in the chat, who said that who has said on Twitter that TSM is already dropping their NACL roster. Have you heard anything along those lines? And are there other teams that you are aware of that are currently in that process?
Are you asking Evie or are you asking me?
You, sorry.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was a shout out. I see Evie in chat, so I wasn't sure if it was
Yeah,
a shout
I
out
was
to
just
them.
I'm trying to give credit where it's due, but also the source of that. So
yes. I would love to give a shout out to LCS Evie for giving me the worst anxiety I've had in a very long time. I do not take kindly to having somebody else tell me information I should know. So good on you for your reporting, and we appreciate you for it. We have not heard specifically about other teams. I know, I have heard specifically that TSM from multiple sources has dropped their team. It could be in part, in whole. I'm not entirely sure yet, but that is what we've heard. As for other teams, we do not have confirmation about where other drops have occurred yet, or if they are occurring. I've talked to at least one GM who's been told that he's likely going to likely have to drop his roster, and that the manager or ownership is telling him to do so. So I expect at least another team there. We know of at least a couple teams who have already told their players to take massive pay cuts, potentially below legal limits, which we're investigating currently. So we're dealing with the fallout as fast as we can, but it is quick. And when we said overnight, we meant it. We see no reason why most of these teams who are chomping at the bit to destroy their own futures won't take the initiative to do so immediately, unless they're trying to hide and wait for somebody else to go first, so that they're not the people who started the bloodletting.
So I see right now on the global contract database that their TSM currently only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players signed to their organization. So I'm not sure if that also includes dropping, or if they're still in the process. But it seems as though a cursory glance at the global contract database would indicate that they do not have those teams or those players anymore. All right, we'll do 2 more quick questions. Roost says, do you feel this is a sign of a much larger problem with the overall profitability of esports? Esports revenue versus gaming revenue is approximately 1% of the total market. We've seen what happened to FaZe Stock, etc. Is esports doomed to be a loss leader for the industry? Phil mentioned being able to see teams' bottom lines in the past.
Yeah, teams of, the model of esports is something that has continued to go through bumps throughout this process, especially with COVID. There were a lot of people who bet on regionality. There were a lot of people who bet on large scale facilities, and all these various bets have gone and been unsuccessful. At the end of the day, the reality is that we all need to accept that esports is first and foremost a marketing tool for game developers. When game developers decide to create microtransaction games that are competitive in nature and have long tail desires where they want the game to exist for 10 plus years, it is clear that they have put their mind to the idea that they will use esports as a way to keep player retention and protect the longevity of their game. People will watch and continue even after they stop playing, and then they'll come back. That's, at least in some part, some calculus or hope here. And there's been a consistent marriage between these competitive esports and these microtransaction long tail games. That's where the industry lives and dies. And many teams are currently facing how to navigate being a valid part of that ecosystem, because players who do the competing and the developers who make the games are the 2 biggest and most valuable parts of the ecosystem. Teams aren't running a gate. They're not doing a whole lot of things, including building brands and things that they used to that inspire generations of fans. So there's a lot of reflection that I know folks are doing. And I know good people on the team side who give a shit and want to make it work and are trying to figure it out and are looking to express the value that they create within the context of that marketing machine that esports is for these developers. And we support understanding and better realizing it. But at the end of the day, a lot of that value, how much an esports watcher, being an esports watcher, causes you to stay with the game and play longer. It's hard to capture that value. We don't have the data from the developers, but clearly there's an effect, and that's something that I think team owners and ourselves would love to capture in the future. We understand how much our players competing and inspiring fans to play and keep returning to the games is impacting the bottom lines of these microtransaction games long in the future.
The last question from the chat. Pep Icon says, "What do you think of the new Challengers Continental competition? Brazil, Latin America, and North America."
I think it sounds great, and it sounds like something we've talked about for 18 months and had nothing to do with the larger changes that are happening today. It felt like something that they tacked onto this announcement, even though it's not a finished plan. It's not a finished plan. They just threw it in there to try and make it seem like they had some semblance of an idea. They're hoping, and we talked about in the transition period, we've been actively talking about a world where this requirement wouldn't be necessary in a couple of years. And this was part of that concept, was how do we add competition that people will be interested in and want to watch, add some regionality component that would in the future make it enticing for organizations to compete at this level. But it's not ready. The program's not finalized, and they're just throwing it in there to make you feel better about the fact that they can 70 people today. On the eve of the summer season.
So I'll just ask you, I know I've seen it already, but there's a lot of people who are just sort of saying, well, this is it. LCS is dead. This is just more LCS in the grave. There's a lot of people who are just kind of cynical or defeatist on all of this, and they feel like it's just more bad news on top of a pile, all indicating that LCS in North America is headed towards doom. I don't know if you have any response or thought on that.
I'm not usually a person who leads with a lot of negativity. It's not my. Usually my wife Tiffany gets mad at me because I'm unreasonably positive and always trying to find the silver lining in something. So if this is your first time encountering me, I'm not usually on the doom and gloom esports side. The industry has a lot of challenges. The industry, is built on investor VC backed model that is toxic and problematic and needs to be solved somehow. And Riot has a big part in that with creating franchising, and so do other developers for the programs they've created that have encouraged this method. I have some culpability. I was a part of a team. I sold to an investment group. I've been there, and it's all real, and we all share in it in some capacity. But I know that there are a lot of people who give a shit. They're fans who are here, who are watching, who care about the LCS, and desperately watched MSI the last few days, hoping and praying against all hope that we were going to come through, and saw the start of Game 3 of the Golden Guardians match and felt hope. And I feel that too, and I still give a shit about esports, and I still give a shit about the teams that compete and the players who make the stories that we love to see. And I'll keep rooting for NA, and I'll keep saying Namen prayers every spring and every fall in the hopes that we can come through, and we will someday as underdogs. And I think that spirit and that passion that'll keep going. And at the end of the day, it's fine if esports isn't football or basketball in scale. It doesn't matter. If we love it, if it gives us joy and we watch it, that's what matters. And so if you like the LCS and you give a shit about the players and you care about us trying to make a Cinderella run every time and you keep showing up for it, then keep doing it, and it'll keep being there. And we can keep celebrating like this thing that we've all grown up with and come to be a big part of our lives together. So don't give up, but hold these people accountable and tell them it matters, that you do care, and that you want to see them care as much as you do, and not just give up on it and treat it like some castaway thing that isn't important. The future of this thing matters. And if they say if John Needham says I'm building the future of sports at Riot, tell him to explain how he's doing it here. How is this decision building the future and not taking it away from us?
Thanks so much, Phil, for the conversation today. I really do appreciate it, and I know this is a very frustrating time for not just you, but for a lot of people who are, as you've said in your post, probably about to be out of a job, and I'm sure it's really frustrating for those folks. It's certainly doesn't feel like good news for the LCS, which I really wish we could get someday. Thank you so much again for the interview. Really appreciate it, and I hope we'll get some new updates soon.
Thanks, Travis. Appreciate the time. Congratulations on your undefeated uh, MTG draft.
Thank you, thank you. Knights are good.
Oh, that's nice.